She challenged him with a 12th grade math problem just to make a joke, but no one expected he'd solve it and uncover a truth that would shake the entire school. At Riverside Middle School in rural Georgia, 14-year-old Malik Bennett was just another quiet kid trying to stay under the radar. A black student from a working-class background, he lived with his single mother and rarely drew attention in class, except when being called out for being late or unprepared. Behind that silence, however, was a secret passion for mathematics that Malik nurtured quietly at the local library, far from the judgmental eyes of school staff. His math teacher, Ms. Lydia Barnes, known for her strict rules and sharp tongue, had a habit of embarrassing students who didn't meet her standards, especially those she believed weren't gifted. On the other side of the hallway, however, was Ms. Serena Holloway, the school's gentle art teacher, who had long suspected that Malik carried more potential than his grades showed. What started as a typical day in Ms. Barnes's class would soon become a defining moment, one that would force the entire school to reckon with how they judged talent, race, and quiet resilience. It was a rainy Thursday morning when Malik Bennett rushed into Ms. Barnes's algebra class, his hoodie soaked and his shoes tracking water across the tile floor. He had spent the last hour helping his mother fix a flat tire on their old Ford, and now he was late. Again. The moment he stepped in, Ms. Barnes stopped mid-sentence, her eyes narrowing. "Nice of you to join us, Mr. Bennett," she said sharply. "Why don't you come up here and show us your brilliance, since you seem to think the rules don't apply to you?" Her voice dripped with sarcasm as she erased the current equation on the board and replaced it with a problem filled with complex integrals, content typically reserved for 12th grade AP calculus. The class chuckled nervously. Everyone knew this wasn't part of their curriculum. It was a calculated humiliation tactic, one Ms. Barnes had used before to make examples out of students who challenged her authority. Malik hesitated. The symbols looked familiar, eerily so. While the rest of the class was spending their evenings on TikTok and video games, he had been buried in library books, fascinated by numbers that danced through formulas and theorems. Slowly, he stepped forward, picked up the dry erase marker with a trembling hand, and began to solve the equation. At first, the room was filled with muffled laughter and whispers, but those sounds gradually faded into silence as Malik's hand moved confidently across the board, line by line, substitution by substitution, until the final answer stood there, underlined. For a long second, no one spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the wall clock and the soft hum of the overhead lights. Ms. Barnes stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, eyes scanning the board as if trying to find a flaw. Then her expression hardened. "Where did you learn this?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. "You've never even passed a unit test in my class. This isn't possible." Malik looked at her, eyes steady but cautious. "I just solved it," he said. "It's the same method in the calculus textbook at the library." That seemed to enrage her further. "Are you telling me you've been cheating?" she snapped. "Is that what this is? You've been memorizing problems from somewhere, using a phone under your desk?" Malik shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "No, ma'am," but Ms. Barnes wouldn't hear it. "Sit down. You'll explain yourself to the principal. This is academic dishonesty, plain and simple." The class sat stunned as Malik returned to his seat, his face burning not from shame, but disbelief. What had just happened wasn't a victory. It was an accusation. And in that moment, he realized that no matter how hard he worked, some people weren't ready to believe that a kid like him could be brilliant. But what neither Ms. Barnes nor the class knew, that this single act of defiance would be the spark that changed everything. Malik sat stiffly on the wooden bench outside the principal's office, his hands clenched tightly around the frayed straps of his backpack. Inside, he could hear Ms. Barnes's voice rising and falling, her tone a mixture of outrage and forced professionalism as she recounted what had happened in class. Malik stared at the scuffed floor tiles and said nothing. Not to the secretary, who occasionally glanced at him with thinly veiled suspicion. Not to the assistant principal, who walked by without offering so much as a nod. When Principal Hayes finally called him in, Malik walked into the office with his shoulders tense, but his chin held just high enough to signal he wasn't broken. At least not yet. Principal Hayes, a wiry man with salt and pepper hair and a deep voice, motioned for Malik to sit. "Ms. Barnes says you cheated," he he said bluntly, flipping open a folder. "She says you solved a problem well beyond your grade level. Is that true?" Malik opened his mouth, then closed it again. What could he say? That he'd been secretly teaching himself calculus using discarded textbooks from the community library. That for 2 years he'd been watching MIT lectures online and solving problems by flashlight while his mum worked the night shift at the diner. That didn't sound believable, not coming from a kid who had a C in pre-algebra and never raised his hand in class. And even if it did, what would his mom think? She already worried he was overworking himself, staying up late to read and skipping video games to stare at notebooks. She'd once told him, "Malik, don't burn yourself out trying to prove yourself to people who already made up their minds." She meant it with love, but the words stuck like concrete, so instead he said the only thing he could manage, "I didn't cheat." Principal Hayes narrowed his eyes. "Then how do you explain it?" Malik shrugged slightly. "I just figured it out." The principal leaned back, unconvinced, and the silence stretched until the tension in the room felt suffocating. But what no one in that room knew, what hadn't yet been revealed, was that Ms. Barnes herself carried a hidden wound. Nearly a decade earlier, during her time teaching at a prestigious STEM magnet school, one of her brightest students, a young black boy named Julian West, had vanished under mysterious circumstances. He had been a prodigy, solving college-level math before he was 15, and his disappearance had rocked the district. Though officially ruled an abduction, rumors swirled about pressure, breakdowns, and academic burnout. Since then, Ms. Barnes had grown quietly resentful of students who showed unexpected brilliance, especially those who reminded her of Julian. She masked that resentment in strict standards and rigid discipline, convincing herself she was preparing them for the real world. But deep down, a festering fear lingered, that she would once again be eclipsed by a young black student who was smarter, faster, and more gifted than she'd ever been. Malik's moment at the whiteboard had pierced something raw in her, and rather than face it, she reached for control the only way she knew how, by accusing him. But Malik didn't know any of that yet. All he knew was that the truth didn't matter, because no one believed it. Not yet. Just when it seemed like Malik's fate had been sealed behind closed office doors and whispered accusations, someone finally spoke up. Ms. Serena Holloway, the school's soft-spoken but observant art teacher, had watched the events unfold with growing unease. She requested a meeting with Principal Hayes and entered the room with a stack of Malik's old sketchbooks in hand. "Before you go any further," she said calmly but firmly, "I think you need to see this." "I didn't know," she whispered. Elijah didn't speak for a while, the glow of the laptop flickering across his clenched jaw. It would have been easy to hate her in that moment, to walk away, to let bitterness take root. But instead he closed the screen, stood up and said, "Then we make it right." That night marked a quiet turning point, not just in their plan, but in their bond. Elijah was no longer driven by what he'd lost, but by what he could expose. Riley was no longer just running from her father. She was running towards something too. Accountability, redemption, and the possibility that even someone born into privilege could choose a different legacy. The plan was bold, borderline reckless, and had only one shot at working. With Nina's legal expertise, Riley's insider knowledge, and Elijah's unflinching determination, they orchestrated a public takedown that would unfold at the West Coast Tech Forum, one of the most influential technology conferences in the country. Gregory Monroe was scheduled to deliver the keynote address on the future of ethical innovation, and the irony was not lost on any of them. The team infiltrated the audiovisual systems 2 days in advance, thanks to a backdoor Nina's tech contact quietly inserted into the conference's network. The night before the event, Riley recorded a message in one take, her voice steady but her eyes heavy with the weight of truth. On the day of the speech, the ballroom was packed with venture capitalists, startup founders, and journalists from every major outlet. Gregory walked on stage to thunderous applause, flanked by banners touting data, transparency, and trust. He adjusted his suit, smiled at the cameras, and began his carefully rehearsed speech. But midway through his second slide, the lights dimmed. The LED walls behind him flickered, then lit up with something entirely unplanned. A stream of emails showing investor manipulation, spreadsheets detailing under-the-table payouts, and legal memos implicating Monroe Capital in targeted attacks on minority-owned startups. Gasps echoed across the room. Riley's pre-recorded video took over the screen. She introduced herself not as Gregory Monroe's daughter, but as a whistleblower who had uncovered a coordinated systemic campaign to destroy competition, suppress innovation, and silence minority voices in tech. She didn't flinch when she revealed that she was carrying the child of Caleb Rowe, the man her father had professionally ruined and possibly had disappeared. "I won't raise this child under a name built on fear and corruption," she said, her voice resolute. "This ends now." As murmurs swept through the room, another figure emerged from the side of the stage. Elijah, dressed in a simple charcoal suit, stepped forward with a calmness that silenced even the most skeptical attendees. Gregory, now visibly shaken, locked eyes with him. "You remember me," Elijah said evenly. "You didn't just sabotage my company, you tried to erase everything I stood for, but I'm still here." Gregory tried to protest, waving at the technicians to cut the feed, but Nina had locked the system. The screens continued to display document after document, all admissible in court, all traceable to Monroe's own signature. A live ticker showed Monroe Capital's stock plummeting in real time. Reporters began to stand, shouting questions. "Mr. Monroe, do you deny ordering these attacks? Is it true your firm targeted Black-owned startups? Are you aware of the implications of Project Halo?" Security moved to escort Gregory off stage, but he froze, caught in the glare of hundreds of eyes and the undeniable truth unraveling behind him. This wasn't just a press ambush, it was a reckoning. Elijah didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone said everything. For the first time, the man who had once been dismissed as a failure stood not in shame, but in power. Power built not on wealth or influence, but on truth. And this time, the whole world was watching. In the weeks following the public takedown at the tech conference, federal agents moved swiftly. Gregory Monroe was arrested on charges including financial fraud, antitrust violations, obstruction of justice, and large-scale breaches of consumer privacy. The evidence presented by Riley, Elijah, and Nina was airtight. Cross-referenced files, internal memos, signed directives, and transactional trails that painted a damning portrait of systematic abuse and corruption. His arrest sparked a wave of investigations across multiple agencies, and his carefully constructed empire began to collapse. While the media circled around Gregory's fall from grace, Elijah quietly began rebuilding. Not a company, but a movement. The federal government issued a settlement to compensate affected businesses, and Elijah used his portion to lay the foundation for something new. Nova Fund, a venture capital incubator designed specifically for startups led by underrepresented founders, Black, Latino, Indigenous, LGBTQ+, and women who had long been denied a seat at the table. But Elijah didn't do it alone. Riley, now disinherited from her father's fortune, but empowered by the truth she helped expose, dedicated the remaining assets she had access to in building Nova Fund's first portfolio. Nina became the head of the fund's legal division, helping startups navigate the complex terrain that once crushed Elijah. The three of them, along with former founders who had also suffered under Monroe Capital's predatory practices, built a model not just for investment, but for accountability and equity. The fund wasn't about chasing unicorns, it was about making sure the next Elijah Carter didn't get erased before he had a chance to launch. Months later, Riley gave birth to a healthy baby girl named Lila, and in that hospital room, surrounded by people who had become family through fire, she made a vow to raise her daughter in a world where integrity mattered more than power, and where wealth wasn't built on the backs of others. She turned down press interviews and corporate book deals, instead choosing to work quietly behind the scenes, mentoring female founders and advocating for ethical innovation. Meanwhile, Elijah, who once doubted he'd ever return to the tech world, found himself not only back in it, but reshaping it. He spoke at universities, mentored teenagers from low-income communities, and used his story as both a warning and a blueprint. Nova Fund expanded to 3 cities in its first year and helped launch over a dozen startups, all of which prioritized community, transparency, and purpose over valuation hype. At the fund's 1-year anniversary gala, Elijah stood before a crowd of entrepreneurs, investors, and activists, many of whom had once been considered unfundable, and raised a glass not to profits, but to perseverance. "This," he said, "is what rebuilding looks like. Not just for a business, but for a broken system." Across the ballroom, Riley watched with quiet pride, holding Lila in her arms, knowing that while the road to redemption had been painful and public, it had also been necessary. Gregory Monroe had tried to bury the truth, but from the wreckage, something far more powerful had been born. A network of leaders who didn't just want to succeed. They wanted to change what success meant for everyone. 3 years later, the rooftop of Nova Fund's headquarters buzzed with quiet excitement as a new cohort of young entrepreneurs prepared to pitch their ideas in the fund's first national showcase. Elijah Carter stood near the edge, his eyes scanning the skyline of a city he once thought would forget him. He wore no tie, just a clean white shirt and a calm confidence that came from building something that mattered. Behind him, Riley approached, carrying her toddler daughter Lila, whose bright eyes and messy curls mirrored her mother's defiance and her father's legacy. Riley smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You pulled me out of a trunk that night," she said softly. "Now look at you, lifting an entire generation." Elijah chuckled, eyes still on the horizon, and simply replied, "We pulled each other out." The moment was quiet, but it echoed louder than any headline that had once defined their fall and rise. Together, they had helped take down a corrupt empire and, more importantly, helped build a new blueprint for what justice could look like. Nova Fund had now launched over 30 startups and mentored dozens more, each one backed not by pedigree, but by potential. And yet, the true impact wasn't measured in funding rounds or press coverage. It was in the people who no longer felt invisible, no longer felt like long shots, no longer had to ask permission to dream. Sometimes the greatest revolutions don't begin with grand speeches or protests. They begin with small human moments, a flat tire on a rainy road, a stranger offering a ride, a decision to trust someone you have every reason not to. That night in the woods, Elijah had every reason to keep driving, to protect what little was left of his life. But instead he stopped, and that simple act of kindness became the spark that ignited a cascade of change neither of them could have imagined. The collapse of Gregory Monroe's empire wasn't the ending. It was the clearing of the ground for something new, something just. Justice, real justice, is not just about exposing the corrupt or punishing the powerful. It's about rebuilding the very systems that allowed injustice to thrive in the first place. It's about choosing hope when cynicism feels safer and standing up for what's right even when you're outnumbered, underestimated, or afraid. Malik didn't walk across the stage with fanfare. He accepted his medal with a quiet nod, his mother standing in the crowd with her hand over her heart. But what mattered most wasn't the recognition. It was the shift in how people saw him and how he now saw himself. The journey from invisibility to visibility hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. The lesson is clear and deeply rooted in both justice and humanity. In a world where bias and authority can often overshadow truth, perseverance and humility remain powerful tools for change. Malik's story is not just about academic excellence, it's a reminder that potential doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits patiently to be seen, tested, and finally heard. His resilience in the face of systemic dismissal speaks volumes about the quiet strength many students carry every day. Students who are told directly or indirectly that they are not enough because they don't fit a particular mold. But Malik proved that true brilliance isn't about where you come from, how loud you speak, or how polished your background is. It's about passion, integrity, and the courage to stand up even when standing hurts. His journey challenges educators, parents, and peers alike to rethink what giftedness looks like and to remember that our assumptions can be the very thing that blocks a young mind from reaching its full potential. It teaches us that when we choose to truly listen, nurture, and uplift, we don't just transform one life, we reshape the future of a community. Never underestimate a student simply because they're quiet, struggling, or overlooked. Sometimes the ones we least expect are carrying the answers that can change everything. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey of courage, brilliance, and transformation. Malik's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes The greatest minds are hidden in the quietest corners, and all it takes is one moment of truth to bring their light into the world. If this story moved you, made you reflect, or inspired you to see others more clearly, we invite you to become part of our growing community. At X Daily Stories, we share real, thought-provoking narratives that uncover hidden strength, challenge injustice, and celebrate the human spirit. Every story is crafted to not only entertain, but to leave you with a lesson that stays with you long after the final scene. If you believe in the power of storytelling to create change, subscribe to the channel right now and hit the notification bell so you never miss a new release. We publish new stories every day that will touch your heart, stir your soul, and remind you of the good that still exists in the world. Subscribe today to X Daily Stories, where every voice matters, every truth deserves to be heard, and every story has the power to make a difference.